Florida man convicted of killing his girlfriend and her 3 children in 1998 is set to be executed.
The Supreme Court, the highest court in the state, has spoken, sealing his fate. The execution is scheduled for May 1st, 2025.
A name that once served his country is now written into the darkest chapters of Florida's criminal history. Jeffrey Hutchinson, a Gulf War veteran, faces execution after brutally ending the lives of a mother and her 3 innocent children. For decades, appeals and controversies have delayed justice. But now, the final hour approaches. On a September night in 1998, what began as a domestic argument turned into a massacre. Hutchinson, armed with a shotgun, coldly ended the lives of Renee Floridi and her 3 young children. The brutality stunned a quiet community. The victims, ages just 9, 7, and 4, never had a chance. His crime was not an impulsive act, but a deliberate, merciless execution, and it would forever stain the town of Crestview, Florida. Each was executed with cold precision, a single shotgun blast to the head, extinguishing their lives. In the 2 decades since his conviction, Hutchinson fought a losing battle against his fate. Diagnosed with Gulf War syndrome, he claimed cognitive impairment, hoping for mercy from the courts. But time and again, judges ruled that his crimes outweighed any condition. Appeals citing mental illness, intoxication, and conspiracy collapsed under overwhelming evidence.
County attorneys for an inmate on Florida's death row will try to convince a judge he should not be put to death because he is not mentally sound.
As May 1st draws closer, the preparations for Hutchinson's execution intensify. The state of Florida reaffirms its decision to carry out the ultimate punishment, and time runs out for any last-minute interventions. On the day of his execution, Hutchinson is expected to receive the traditional final meal. As with many facing their end, he may offer last words, possibly to express remorse, maintain innocence, or remain silent. Meanwhile, the families of Renee and her children wait, hoping that justice finally feels complete. Officials prepare to issue final statements, closing a tragic chapter nearly 3 decades in the making. This month, on April 1st, 2025, Governor Ron DeSantis signed the death warrant for Jeffrey Hutchinson, scheduling him to be put to death on May 1st. The execution reignites fierce debates about capital punishment. Some view it as rightful closure, others as a tragic cycle of more loss. The broader conversation questions whether justice served through death truly heals the wounds inflicted by such brutality.
The execution of Jeffrey Hutchinson will undoubtedly reignite the debate over capital punishment, forcing society to confront the moral and ethical implications of taking a human life.
Among the witnesses at Florida State Prison will be journalists, victims' family members, and officials. Some will describe the scene in harrowing detail, the final moments of a man once seen as a hero, now remembered only for the devastation he caused. Jeffrey Hutchinson's story reminds us that even those once sworn to protect can fall into darkness. His execution does not erase the pain left behind, but stands as a solemn testament to the cost of violence and the enduring demand for justice. When a charming drifter crossed America, few knew a deadly storm was brewing. Glenn Rogers, the so-called cross-country killer, left a trail of blood from California to Florida, ending with death sentences in 2 states. But beyond his brutal crimes, deeper mysteries about his involvement in one of America's most famous murders would haunt the nation for decades.
A serial killer was on the loose,
Some blood underneath the bed.
crossing the country, He lured women with his charm and then struck.
Governor Ron DeSantis officially signed the death warrant for Glenn Rogers nearly 3 decades after his conviction rocked the Bay Area. The suspected serial killer was convicted in the brutal stabbing of Tina Cribbs in 1995.
Glenn Rogers' spree was as methodical as it was brutal. In 1995, he lured Tina Marie Cribbs from a Gibsonton, Florida bar to her death in a Tampa motel. He stole her car, fled the state, and continued a murderous rampage. Rogers was also convicted for killing Sandra Gallagher in California. These crimes sealed his fate, branding him a death row inmate with 2 execution orders. Glenn Rogers, convicted for Tina Cribbs' murder, sentenced to death. On death row, Glenn Rogers remained defiant. Despite overwhelming evidence, he spun stories of dozens more murders and even implicated himself in the Nicole Brown Simpson case. Yet appeals faded and time narrowed as the machinery of justice prepared for its inevitable conclusion.
Just about every other state where Glenn was suspected quietly dropped their investigations.
After decades of uncertainty, a date was finally set. Florida authorities prepared for the end of a chapter soaked in violence and controversy. May 15th, 2025. Glenn Rogers faced lethal injection. His final meal was ordinary. His final words, defiant. Families of Tina Cribbs and Sandra Gallagher watched, hoping for closure. Officials reaffirmed justice had been done for victims who could no longer speak. Execution date set, May 15th, Rogers facing death. Public reaction was divided. Some saw a long overdue reckoning. Others lamented unanswered questions about Rogers' true number of victims and his alleged link to Nicole Brown Simpson. Justice, perhaps, but justice incomplete. Witnesses described the moment with somber precision. A quiet room, a final breath, and the closing of a violent life. For the families, a brief peace. For investigators, the heavy reminder that justice does not always mean all truths are known. Rogers left at least 11 children without mothers. Glenn Rogers' trail of death ended where it began, with lives shattered and answers left behind. Justice caught him, but even in death, the shadows he cast across America remain. Inside the towering walls of Indiana's oldest maximum security prison, death row is not just a sentence. It's a slow march toward the inevitable. Among these men is Benjamin Richie, whose crime and fate reveal the stark reality of America's ultimate punishment. This is not just a story of crime. It's a story of time, regret, and the final journey no one returns from.
Indiana Attorney General Todd Rokita pushing for the execution of a man convicted of killing a cop. Rokita now asking the state Supreme Court to set an execution date for Benjamin Richie for May 20th.
The state Supreme Court just set the execution date for Benjamin Richie. He is now scheduled to be executed on May 20th.
The Indiana Supreme Court today set an execution date for Benjamin Richie. His execution must be carried out on May 20th of this year.
September 2000, a simple carjacking plan spiraled into deadly violence. On parole and armed, Benjamin Richie led police on a reckless chase through Beech Grove. Officer William Toney, pursuing him on foot, became the target of fatal gunfire. A bullet, fired in panic and defiance, struck Toney down, ending a life committed to service and sending Richie into the jaws of death row. For over 2 decades, Benjamin Richie lived under the shadow of death. Behind the stark walls of Indiana State Prison, he found a life both ordinary and desperate, marrying a British pen pal, fighting futile appeals, and accepting a fate sealed long ago. His final years were marked not by violence, but by the slow erosion of hope.
I was having sex in the visiting room.
You're not supposed to do that, though, are you?
It was worth it, though, man. It was worth it. It was the best minute, 30 seconds of my life.
Really? But, I mean, you knew what the consequences would be.
Yeah.
May 2025. Indiana, dormant in executions for years, reignites its death chamber. With the drug protocols restored and all appeals exhausted, the final hours for Benjamin Richie draw near. For the state, for the victim's family, for Richie himself. Time is running out. May 20th. Before the sunrise, Benjamin Richie will be executed. His final request, a modest meal of comfort food. His last words, an apology, whispered with regret, but too late to change the past. For Officer Tony's family, it's a somber end to 25 years of waiting. Officials call it justice served, but the echoes of that fateful night in 2000 remain.
He will die. The state Supreme Court just set the execution date for Benjamin Richie. He is now scheduled to be executed on May 20th for the murder of Officer Bill Toney. Richie has exhausted.
The execution reignited fierce debates. Supporters hailed it as overdue justice for a fallen officer. Opponents questioned the morality of state-sanctioned death after decades of confinement. In a nation where the death penalty is fading, Benjamin Richie's final moments fuel a conversation far beyond Indiana's prison walls. Public reaction to the resumption of executions and broader death penalty debate. In the sterile, fluorescent-lit execution chamber, a select few bore witness. Silent but observant, family, officials, guards. They watched a life extinguished by the state. For some, it was closure. For others, a somber reminder that no death, even one sanctioned by law, comes without haunting aftershocks.
Execution happens. Well, according to Indiana law, the only people allowed to be present are the prison warden, those selected to assist in the execution, the prison physician, one additional physician, the condemned person's spiritual advisor, and the prison chaplain. A select number of friends or relatives are allowed to view the process from an adjacent room, along with up to 8 relatives of the victims.
Benjamin Richie's story is a mirror of impulsive violence, of the slow machinery of justice, and of a society wrestling with the finality of death. Officer William Toney's badge may have been buried long ago, but his legacy endured. And as the prison gates closed one final time, it was clear. Some acts leave scars no execution can heal. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening in Tennessee, but instead it marked a chilling moment of finality. Oscar Franklin Smith, convicted of a brutal triple murder, was set to become the first man executed in Tennessee since the pandemic. Decades of legal battles, last-minute appeals, and a stunning reprieve would define his story and his final hours.
The man convicted in the death of his estranged wife and her 2 sons was set to be put to death within the next.
The tragedy began on a chilling night in October 1989. Smith's estranged wife, Judith Lynn Robird Smith, and her teenage sons Chad and Jason Burnett were found brutally murdered in their South Nashville home. The crime scene was bloody, violent, and left investigators reeling. Insurance money was suspected as a motive, and Smith's prior threats against the victims, along with forensic evidence, led to his arrest and conviction in 1990.
Police say what they found inside this house at 324 Ludi Street was brutal and very bloody.
The investigation uncovered a murder for insurance money scheme.
For more than 3 decades, Oscar Smith lived under the shadow of death at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution. Over the years, he fought tirelessly, appealing convictions, presenting new DNA evidence and seeking clemency. Yet every legal path closed one after another. Even in his final days, Smith's defense team insisted he was an innocent man about to die, citing a new analysis showing the palm print on the murder weapon did not match
execution.
Smith.
Smith's defense team says, though, new DNA evidence proves he is innocent, saying the state is, quote,
As the execution date approached, tension built inside and outside the prison walls. Vigils were planned, last appeals filed. Smith had already chosen his final meal, and media crews assembled at Riverbend for what was expected to be Tennessee's first execution since the pandemic. On the day of his execution, Oscar Smith was served his last meal, a double bacon cheeseburger, deep dish apple pie, and vanilla bean ice cream. Family members of his victims prepared to witness justice, or what they believed was justice, finally carried out. Yet, in a shocking twist, just 1 hour before the scheduled execution, Governor Bill Lee issued a temporary reprieve due to protocol concerns with the lethal injection process.
But just about an hour before, Governor Bill Lee said it was being delayed due to an oversight in preparation for lethal injection.
Public reaction was immediate and divided. Advocacy groups argued the reprieve proved deep flaws in Tennessee's death penalty system, calling for full investigations and suspensions of future executions. Meanwhile, victims' families, having waited more than 30 years for closure, expressed frustration and heartbreak over yet another delay.
The grief that they have suffered and continue to go through, the trauma, and the fact that this has gone on for 30 years.
The case of Oscar Franklin Smith remains a haunting reminder of the scars left behind by violent crimes, of the fallibility of the justice system, and of the endless ripples caused by decisions made decades ago. Whether seen as justice delayed or justice denied, Smith's story, and the story of those he left behind, is far from over.